Mulberry trees. Do you know anything about mulberry trees? Well, you're about to on this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. I know what you're thinking. Is Rob actually going to do a show about mulberry trees? Well, yes, I am, as a matter of fact. Whether you're into plants or not, whether you're into trees or not, mulberry trees are very interesting plants. And they actually produce a fruit called a mulberry. Well, if you're like me, most of the time when you hear something like mulberry, gooseberry, rhubarb, if you don't know anything about them, you have no idea what people are talking about. But they actually are berries and they grow on a tree. And I guess there is such a thing as a mulberry bush. But the ones that I have, I don't call bushes, I call trees. Because they keep getting bigger and bigger. A mulberry resembles a blackberry. They look a lot like blackberries, but blackberries grow on bushes. Thorny bushes. The kind of bush that'll stick you in the hand, stick you in the legs when you're walking through them. They got thorns on them. And as often as not, when you see something that you refer to, or you see an area that you refer to as a briar patch, it's probably blackberry bushes. But a mulberry is very similar to a blackberry. It looks a lot like a blackberry. Not quite as sweet as a blackberry, but still, in shape, size, and appearance, they're very much like a blackberry. But they grow on trees. And because they grow on trees, the birds normally get to them before I do. And this is how the plants propagate. This is how they spread their seeds, as they count on these birds to eat them. And then once the berry goes through the digestive tract of a bird, wherever the seed lands, starts a new mulberry tree. Well, you see, the reason I got interested in mulberry trees in the first place is I had this tree, this little tree, growing in my backyard. Then I got a couple of other little trees that look very similar to them, but they were different. This is one of the interesting things about mulberry trees. I'm enough of an outdoorsman that I can identify most common trees that grow in my area by the shape of the leaf. Well, mulberry trees can have a different shaped leaf on the same branch. Sometimes they're kind of pear-shaped, very similar to an elm tree leaf. And sometimes they have irregular shapes, similar to an oak leaf or a fig leaf. Sometimes they're wide, sometimes they're narrow, sometimes they're pointed, sometimes they're not. And you can find all these different shapes of leaf on the same branch of the same tree. So I had a hard time identifying these little small trees that were growing up in my backyard. Well, like a lot of people who have various vines and briar patches and honeysuckles growing wild in a part of the yard that you very infrequently visit, I had kind of this thicket, less than a jungle, less than woods, but I just had all these random plants growing up in my backyard. And it kind of got away from me. For the first few years that we lived there, I did a pretty good job of keeping the backyard managed, clean and tidy, and kept the weeds down. But after a few years, places in my backyard where little small trees and stuff were growing up, and honeysuckles and briars, I just said, I'll get around to it one of these days. Well, these little trees kept getting bigger and bigger. So by the time I got around to clearing out the brush in my backyard, these trees had grown up enough that they kind of filled in a canopy of leaves and provided some excellent shade for when I was working in the yard and I wanted to get out of the sun for a little bit. I could go underneath one of these trees. And it was kind of like an umbrella of leaves pretty much obscuring the sun. So not unlike Charlie Brown in the Peanuts Christmas cartoon, I thought to myself, it's not such a bad little tree. I'll just let it continue to grow. And I noticed that even though the leaves were weird and I couldn't identify this plant, that I had 3 of these plants that had actually gotten up to a fairly decent size, that they were all providing shade. And what I noticed was, even though it had weird shaped leaves and I didn't know what kind of tree it was, I had several other of these little small trees that were growing, and they all had similarly shaped, equally unidentifiable leaves, but they were all getting to be of a decent size and they were providing shade. So I said, I'll just let these grow for a while. Well, one day I noticed that there were little green berries that seemed to be just randomly popping out on this tree. And I thought, that's interesting. And then they turned dark, like a blackberry. And they looked very similar to a blackberry when they were ripe. Well, I still didn't know what they were, so I didn't dare eat one, because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was going to be poisonous or not, so I didn't dare eat one. But it understandably aroused my curiosity. I tried to research it online, but I couldn't find anything. So I finally took a picture and showed the picture to my friend Bill at work, who was like an amateur horticulturist. And I said, Bill, tell me what kind of tree this is. And I handed him my phone, and he enlarged the picture, And he said, oh, that's a mulberry. I said, get out. He said, yeah. I said, can you eat them? He said, yeah, you can eat them. He said they taste like blackberries. Not quite as sweet as blackberries, but very similar to blackberries. And I'm like, get out. He said, no, really. So I was just out in the yard today looking at my mulberry trees. They have wide leaves, provide a lot of shade. And because they make berries, there were birds constantly flying in and out of them. And I thought to myself, this is a nice little tree. And I got to thinking, I'm glad I didn't cut these trees down. I'm glad I let them get big enough that they actually started making berries. I'm glad I let these trees live. Because there again, just like Charlie Brown and the Christmas tree, the mulberry tree is not such a bad little tree. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. I appreciate you listening. Leave me a comment, click on like, click on subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye now.